Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Caroline Lustenberger. In this part, we cover practical ways to manage sleeping challenges and tips for handling early morning wake-ups. Caroline also shares her thoughts on sleeping supplements and the role of sleep trackers. We also talk about the Herencia initiative, where truly groundbreaking research is being done to find a cure for Alzheimer's. Let's get back into it.
Is there at any point when you would recommend people take dietary supplements for sleep because they feel this isn't working?
I'm not a big fan of supplements itself because there's not so much research out there really supporting any of those. I think a lot of with magnesium was in the media. I think magnesium is good in terms of basically for your muscles not to have cramps and so on. There is not really much evidence showing that it improves directly your sleep, if at all, very, very lightly. Of course, having a bit of magnesium may be just in general beneficial for you. Also, when it comes to muscles, there is no study showing that it hurts your sleep. So there is also no harm to it if you try to use it. But other supplements, I would not know of. And when it comes, for instance, to melatonin, this is something that needs prescription in Switzerland. So you cannot just buy it over the counter. And I think this is also good because a lot of people forget that melatonin is not a sleep hormone. It's not there to just make you sleep better. It's a circadian hormone. It's a darkness hormone. And the importance when you use it is more that when you have like jet lag or your inner clock shifted, that it can help you reshift it. And it would need to be taken very regularly at right times. And I think sometimes it's just misused and just taken whenever you try to sleep and cannot fall asleep. So I also don't recommend that without not having it prescribed by an expert who knows exactly how to use it correctly.
So things like sleeping pills or even antihistamines, which typically make you drowsy. When you take one of those, it feels like you're having a good sleep because it just knocks you out in your sleep. But my understanding is that's actually not the case. Is it true that typically a lot of these sleeping pills would actually give you your quality of sleep wouldn't be as good?
Exactly. So I would also not recommend taking any sleeping pills without having it prescribed by a sleep expert. And it should also never be taken long term. There are multiple reasons for that. I mean, it's not necessarily natural sleep that you have in a way that typically would be the case. You might have a change in your sleep architecture that is not ideal for you. It is also that you can get addicted to these. And I think there are much better ways out there to improve sleep. I give you examples. So one of the most common reasons why people or sleep disorders that people have is insomnia, problem to fall and stay asleep. And in most of the cases, this can be very well and also for the long term treated with cognitive behavioral therapy. So basically changing habits and new behavioral patterns. And there are great programs out there that are prescribed by experts if you have problems with that. And the first line of treatment should never be medication.
Now, going back to waking up, I am certainly someone who wakes up with a buzzing mind more often than I would like. And besides using that time to do something I enjoy, if it is particularly early, is there anything you would recommend to get back to sleep?
I think you should not try to actively fall asleep again, like pressure yourself. I think you should use the time to maybe get up. Like, of course, you can first try to stay in bed for some while and try. But if you realize, hey, it's not working, don't stress yourself, get up. And don't turn on lights or anything that arouses you, but maybe, sit in a chair, maybe read something with a very dark light. Try to get back to something that relaxes you again, and then try again to sleep. If sleep doesn't come, don't worry too much. I always tell myself, sleep regulates itself to a certain degree. So when I have a bad night, my sleep pressure will be higher for the next sleep period. And that means I will also sleep deeper and more consolidated the next night.
Is the concept of a sleep bank true? I remember learning about this in school, and the theory behind it is if you require 8 hours and then one day you only get 7 hours, well then at some point you need to get 9 hours to sort of give that back to the bank because you've essentially borrowed an hour. Is that conceptually, is that true?
It is partially true. So there is homeostatic effects to that. That means if you skip a few hours a night before, the next night your so-called sleep pressure is higher, and then it will be shown at one point that you have deeper sleep. So it's not just the length of sleep, also how deep you sleep, it will be more pronounced. And you might also sleep a bit longer. It might not necessarily be exactly an hour because you also sleep deeper, but it might be a bit longer. But I think what I would emphasize is that this is maybe on a daily basis sometimes okay, but you shouldn't bank sleep by having day after day after day after day sleep deprivation and then wait for 2 weeks later to say catching up on sleep. I think that's not ideal to do. It's okay if it's a few nights here and then, but it shouldn't be the regular habits that you do.
Yeah, I think thanks to my partying days in my 20s, I think realistically my deficit is big.
Hopefully you have now recovered from that. I think some people face that too, but I also think it's just important that people understand it's okay to have once a night not so good and maybe going out another night, but it shouldn't be very regular and back to back, right? Something that is not ideal for brain and body health.
How effective are naps for recovering that sleep? If you only got 6 hours and you need 8, how effective would a 15-minute nap be throughout the following day?
So I want to emphasize 2 points. On one side, some positive aspects about taking naps. If you really cannot get enough sleep at night for whatever reason, maybe you have a newborn or your work just didn't allow for you to sleep the amount of hours you need, a power nap can certainly help to also give you, again, a bit of an energy kick during the day. But there I recommend not to sleep longer than 20 minutes. For the reason that also after 20 minutes, even if you don't have the feeling you really were asleep, more dosing helps you to give you some productivity, some feeling of awake and energy, right? If you sleep too long, and especially later in the afternoon, what happens is that for the next night, your sleep pressure will be reduced. And that means that it can be that the night again is not that consolidated and you have fragmented sleep. And here also comes the negative side. If you can, I recommend to really sleep specifically at night for enough time and not nap. Because if you start the habit of napping long, what happens is at night, you will have more problems sleeping consolidated because you have sleep. And there is increasing research that it's not just how much sleep you had over 24 hours that you say, well, I can just split up, right, in 4 times 6 hours or whatever. No, sorry, about 4 times 2 hours or something like that. But that a longer consolidated period might be important and not just the sum over 24 hours that you got in sleep.
I wanted to ask you about with the popularity of smartwatches, the rise of sleep tracking devices. How useful is it to monitor your sleep via a watch?
I think it's again two-sided perspectives on sleep tracking. I think it can be interesting to track your sleep and identify patterns and maybe learn more about sleep, but it also can create unnecessary pressure and even misinformation about sleep. First of all, when you think about the positive side, I always say you can use the sleep tracker as like a tool to better understand your sleep a bit in an objective way. That means, for instance, you can start to learn patterns. I, for instance, use my sleep tracker not to specifically look at how my sleep score was or how sleep stages look like, but rather, for instance, how my heart rate looked like. when I slept, because that's normally very accurately measured with these devices. And what I realized is, and that's also shown in literature, when you, for instance, drink alcohol before sleep, your heart rate is higher during sleep, so your heart might have less of relaxation during sleep. Or before I get sick, actually a few days before I get sick, I also realize that my heart rate starts to be higher than normally during night. But what I want to emphasize is there are certain risks and limitations to the trackers, because the precision of these trackers varies greatly, and they typically rely on movement and sometimes heart rate rather than brain activity. And brain activity is typically the gold standard to really precisely define the amount of sleep, but also your sleep stages. So you can have very inaccurate information about how your sleep staging was, right? You might get an information like I have 5% deep sleep and 20% REM sleep, but very likely these numbers are not correct. And what that means is that this can lead to more problems because suddenly people start to worry about something that might not even be a problem. And there is even a disorder that started because of this possibility to do sleep tracking, because some people become very fixated of reaching the perfect sleep. Maybe they check to have a sleep score of 100 from 100. And this ironically can even lead to sleep problems because they have more stress, and a lot of sleep experts, they suddenly have in their praxis people who basically start to have sleep problems because of trying to get the perfect sleep, which is which is actually not ideal when you think about this. It's very ironic, yes. And what I then say is like, you can use it, but be very have a healthy skepticism about it, and understand these are just tools, but they're not definitive measures and diagnostics measures of your sleep. And also avoid letting the device dictate your own perception about sleep. If you feel great during the day, if you feel rested, you are rested. Trust that. Don't then look at your sleep score and say, oh, it was only 50 today. Maybe I slept bad, so maybe I should feel bad now. Right? I think this is not the right approach. So don't use it to add more pressure. More like an exploration tool, I always say. Be curious about what you maybe see about your sleep or some patterns that emerge.
Yeah, I'm curious about how data and technology evolves to give us more insights about sleep. Do you have many insights in some emerging areas of research in sleep science that get you excited?
Well, there are so many questions about sleep that are not answered yet. And I think with every study I do, there are more questions coming up than answers. I think one very important thing is that we still don't really know exactly what the functions of sleep are, and more specifically also which aspects of sleep are important for which functions of sleep. And so one area I'm very interested in is to develop new ways of modulating brain activity during sleep, very specifically, and see what happens to brain and body functions when I do that. For instance, I'm very interested to see how deep sleep, and specifically these slow waves that are these brain activity patterns that are characterizing deep sleep, how they are important for our cardiovascular health. And, when you have a better understanding of that, you can also develop interventions and tools that can target these brain activity patterns and on one hand maybe improve health, but also restore health in case you have, for instance, sleep problems or certain disorders that might also have sleep as a fundamental component of the disorder itself.
I wanted to clarify something. You said we don't know the functions of sleep. What do you mean by that exactly?
There are always more and more functions and ideas coming up. So what is really important that sleep is there, and what can also happen without sleep, right? That's an important question. And now we get more and more functions that might really only happen during sleep. I just give you an example. Only a few years ago, it was recognized that sleep might act as a dishwasher to our brain. So there is, due to our activity of our brain cells, of our neurons, there is also toxic byproducts produced. And at one point, they need to be cleaned away. And now studies found that this specifically happens during deep sleep and is not as effectively or actually almost not at all happening during wakefulness. So it's really something that requires sleep in order to have a healthy brain. But this was only discovered a few years ago. And I had a study recently which really showed that sleep is important for like basically having improved cardiac function the next day, right? It was also not that clear how important sleep really is for functions beyond the brain. And that's also starting to emerge more and more with coming studies.
Interesting. I also thought that we seem to be the only species that limits the amount of sleep that we have. Every other animal seems to sleep all the time.
It's also a huge variability within humans, but also when you think across like the animal kingdom, it's a huge variation how much hours are slept. And also even the simplest animals, even without the brain, for instance, the jellyfish that only has single neurons is sleeping. So it's a very universal need, but maybe the functions are not the same for all, right? Because if you don't have a brain and a heart, right, it might not be important for your brain and your heart. It might have other restorative functions. And so I think it's also important to somehow understand like how it's important for us, but also for other species, right?
Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you about also is the Herencia initiative, which you are involved with. Can you tell me what that is you're working on?
Yes, maybe I start first with the link to sleep. So the Herencia initiative is about Alzheimer's disease and finding or creating a platform that is holistically combating Alzheimer's disease. Now, why I was starting to be interested in Alzheimer's disease is that more and more evidence comes that there is a very tight link between sleep and Alzheimer's, and in a bidirectional way. So it assumed that sleep is not only negatively affected as a consequence of the disease itself, but might be even causally involved in basically developing the disease itself. Now, Alzheimer's itself, the problem there is that it's affecting many of us, right? So already, I don't know, like around 55 million has dementia. Most of these cases are because of Alzheimer's. And the biggest problem we face is that the biggest risk to develop Alzheimer's is aging. And because we all get older now, societies are aging, we will have more and more people being affected by it. And the incline is very steep, affecting everyone globally. But there is also a problem that specifically low-income countries are much more affected by it. Now, it's also the only leading cause of death where we have any solution to halt the disease, to prevent the disease, or to even substantially slow it down. And of course, when you think about that in the future, if we continue like that, it will crash our healthcare system if we don't find one. And the Herencia Initiative wants to basically change that. And to emphasize why we need a Herencia Initiative, it's also the question why we don't have a solution yet, right? So, of course, there's a lot of research going on, but to date, we don't have a solution to fight Alzheimer's. And one of the problems is that we cannot diagnose early enough. So at the moment when we diagnose Alzheimer's disease is a time when we basically already have a lot of things destroyed in our brain. It's a time when we have suddenly cognitive deficits. But this only happens about 20 years into the disease when already a lot of irreversible brain damage has happened. And that also means the time we have now clinical trials and test drugs and other interventions, it's likely coming too late. And another problem that we face is that Alzheimer's disease is having multiple impact pillars that we need to address to really solve it holistically. On one hand, we have the research side, so we need to mechanistically understand what is the reason for the disease, what are pathways that we need to target. But then it's also the health side, so how do we translate that into interventions, into early diagnosis. And the last one is the social aspect. So it has a huge social burden, this disease, because it's not just affecting actually the people who have the disease themselves, but the family around, because most of the times the family is doing the caregiving over multiple years, and it's a huge burden. And also what I mentioned before, it's a disparity how much people are affected. So lower income countries will be more affected, and they also are the ones that have the least resources. So also there, this aspect needs to be taken into account. And the Herencia initiative is doing that by, first of all, trying to be more efficient and accelerating the way we find solutions for Alzheimer's disease, and by combining all these impact pillars in one centralized hub. But of course, the question is, how can we do that? Why can we accelerate it? And the key aspect there is that we have access to a very, very special population that is in Colombia, around the Medellin area. And there, it's the world's largest cohort, around multiple thousand of people that have a genetic form of Alzheimer's that is deterministic. That means they have a mutation in a gene that leads to Alzheimer's is 100% certainty when they are 45 to 50 years of age. And this is very unfortunate for them. But it's a unique window of opportunity to basically find an early biomarker and a treatment for Alzheimer's disease. I can quickly explain you why. Because if you now know that someone develops Alzheimer's disease, this solves a huge problem we have in the general population, because there we don't know whether someone develops Alzheimer's. And that also means we cannot really, in a reasonable time frame, innovate on biomarkers, right? Because you would basically have to measure thousands of people today, wait decades, and then when they developed Alzheimer's, some of them you go back and see whether they differed in any kind of biomarkers. And we don't have the time for that. But in this population, you can measure them already now. You can measure them from the moment they are born, and you can look whether there are certain aspects changed, for instance, molecular aspects in the blood or functional aspects in how they perform tasks or other things. And you can see whether there are risk markers that tell you decades before the classical cognitive onsets whether there is a risk for Alzheimer's or not. And it also will help to test treatments that are already available now much earlier, right? We can see whether some of the drugs that have been in studies and that were not that successful or only had a small success rate in slowing down the disease a bit, whether they are more effective if they are applied actually earlier in the disease. And the final reason why they are so important is that, of course, if you know that a person should get Alzheimer's at a certain time, but they don't get it in the end, you know they have a protective factor, and that means they might have also a solution for the disease itself. And that's something that was already found in this population. It's a very beautiful example. She's called Aliria. She died a few years ago, but she didn't die because of Alzheimer's, even though she had this genetic mutation. She died when she was around 70 years of age, so much later than the others that are affected. And thanks to her brain donation, they found that she has not just the disease, but she also had the cure in herself, because she has a protective gene that protects her from Alzheimer's. It was the initial start to understand there might be genes that protect us from the disease. So now we can try to find gene therapies to basically counteract Alzheimer's. And that means I'm absolutely convinced that the place where a solution comes out for Alzheimer will be around this population. But now one problem is there is a population, but we still don't really have a platform to innovate holistically. And that's the second part of the initiative. So we want to build now around this population a stroll or like a world leading center where research, health, care, and social aspects are combined in one local place, and basically enable also other companies to innovate on this population, and at the same time directly translate research findings into diagnoses that and treatments that are available to others. And socially, of course, to make sure that we don't exploit this population, that we also give back to them, that they own what they contribute, right? So that they have the chance to directly also benefit from any intervention that comes out, that they are socially supported, and so on. And it's very important now we are at the stage of basically getting investments for this idea. So if anyone is listening to that and is really interested in being part of this fight against Alzheimer's and innovate on that aspect and invest in the Alzheimer's theme, it's probably a good time to reach out to us.
Now that's the story. How big is the initiative at the moment in terms of number of people, amount of funding, and how long has it been existing for?
So the research around this population is already 30 years in the making, because one Professor Francisco Lopera, who started this initiative, he found his population almost 40 years ago. He had like a person coming into his praxis and reporting like signs of dementia, but this person was like around 40 years of age. And then he was already suspicious that that's very strange because it's all signs of Alzheimer's, but this person is really young, right? And then interesting thing was that while talking to the family members of this person, family members said, well, he's not the only case. We have many more in our village that are like that. And so this population was discovered. And then he had a huge dedication for the research, but also for the patients themselves to advocate for them, to find solutions for them. He started to research, and there are like breakthrough after breakthrough coming out from this population. There are many highly ranked, highly cited publications from this population and from this research group coming out. They already identified 2 protective genes that protects from Alzheimer's, but it's still at the stage where everything is rather low level, where there is not so much funding, or basically there is interest from many companies, but there is not the space to do all this research, to do all these trials that are needed, and to have like a control device or a legal structure around it to also manage that. And that's something you want to change, because basically it's like everything is already there existing. We just need to have a better platform to take advantage of this. But the whole expertise and the population is there. Now we just need to provide basically the infrastructure and the platform and the sources to bring it to the next level.
Since the discovery of this population in Colombia, have these people with this gene been found anywhere else in the world, or is it really isolated to that one place?
I mean, it's a genetic mutation, a very specific gene. You can also find it in other places in the world. Also, some people in Switzerland likely have that, very few, but it's very rare. And the problem is to identify them in the general population takes forever, and you don't really get the numbers you need. There's no place in the world, at least not yet discovered, that has such an amount like clustered together that can be studied.
Caroline, this has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. If people want to know more about you and your work, where can they go and find you?
There are many homepages you can find. Of course, LinkedIn is a great platform. I regularly check that. You can also find me on the ETH homepage. If you Google my name, there is my work email mentioned. And we have our own website in relation to our book that came out. It's I can also give you the link, but it's called sleepfulness.ch. And there it's also like contact details about us and our backgrounds and CVs that you can find.
I'll put all of that details in the show notes of the podcast.
Yeah, so I will look forward to feedback or people reaching out also if they're interested to learn more about this Herencia initiative.
I think it's really amazing work. I'm really, really glad you shared that with me.
Hey, yeah, I just hope we can make it happen, because I really believe that this is where we have the solution for a disease that has no solution yet. I just hope we find the means soon enough to really get that started. So keep your fingers crossed for us that
I
this
definitely will.
research. That is great.
Caroline, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mike, for inviting me.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in once again. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to like, subscribe, or share with a friend. It really does help me out. And don't forget, you can visit howitticks.ch for more details about episodes, transcript, and links to topics we have discussed. You can also use the site to share your feedback. I would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you next time.